Hello, everybody. Just waiting for everyone's connection to establish. Lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently speaking, the Jazeera and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm so pleased to be here with you this evening for this discussion of how to sell a massacre with Peter Charley and Stan Grant. Before I hand you over to Peter and Stan, I'd just like to really quickly reiterate some of that information that you received in email with your link to join this evening's event. So you have all automatically been placed on mute and you'll remain so throughout the evening, but Peter is keen to answer your questions, and if you would like to send those through, you can do so via the chat box. If you can't see it right now, then you should be able to find it by clicking the button that's to the bottom left of your screen. However, I will shortly be posting the link to purchase your copy of How to Sell a Massacre there, and so it will pop up for you any minute now. So if you type your questions there, they will come through to myself and Stan will be addressing those questions later and reading them to Peter. So please start sending those through as and when you think of them. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce Peter Charley. Peter began his career as a reporter on the Sydney Morning Herald and the Sydney Sun newspapers. He later worked as an on-air current affairs reporter and producer at the 7 Network before moving to New York, where he worked as associate producer at 60 Minutes and as a reporter for National Public Radio. He was appointed show producer of the weekly current affairs program The Reporters before working as executive producer of the ABC's Late Line, then SBS's Dateline. In 2014, Peter took up the role of executive producer of Al Jazeera's North American investigative unit based in Washington, D.C. A BAFTA finalist, he is the recipient of countless Australian and international awards for his journalism, including 7 New York Festival Gold Medals and 2 Walkleys. For his documentary How to Sell a Massacre, he received the Kennedy Award for Outstanding Investigative Reporting, the Walkley Scoop of the Year Award, and his 7th New York Festival Gold Medal. In conversation with Peter tonight, as I mentioned, is Stan Grant. Stan is the ABC's International Affairs Analyst. He is one of Australia's most respected and awarded journalists with more than 30 years' experience in radio and television news and current affairs. Stan has a strong reputation for independence and integrity and has interviewed international political and business leaders, including our own prime ministers and senior ministers. Prior to taking up his latest role, Stan served for a decade as a senior international correspondent for CNN in Asia and the Middle East, broadcasting to an audience of millions around the world. Stan is an award-winning and best-selling author of several books and has contributed articles to many major Australian newspapers, magazines, and journals. And so, Peter and Stan, it is now my pleasure to hand over to you for tonight's discussion.
Emma, that's terrific. Thank you so much for that kind invitation. Thank you to everybody who's joined in this evening. And I hope that you enjoy this conversation. I look forward to your questions as well. Let me also reiterate what Emma said there and pay my respects to the Indigenous people on whose ever land that you are today and from wherever you're coming to us. It's a pleasure to be here with Peter. Peter and I go back a very long way. Peter is not just someone that I admire and respect as a journalist. He's a very, very dear and trusted friend, someone who I consider a brother in many respects. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to have this conversation with him. And I'm sure you're going to be as fascinated by this book and Peter's career and Peter's observations on this time that we're living in right now, the world that we are living in, and particularly on the eve of an American election, what the future may hold for the United States. I wanted to start, Peter, first of all, by reading a little bit from your book and then to go to the idea of how to sell a massacre. Now, I'm picking up here after you'd visited the NRA, and you write, as NRA HQ disappeared behind me, I formed a plan. I would create an Australian organisation that mirrored the association's rhetoric. I would appoint an Aussie as its founder and president, I would find ways for that person to climb as high as possible up the NRA's hierarchy. That I was prepared to do this, to set a trap to find the truth, was a sign of how immensely powerful the gun lobby had become in the US. I want to build a Trojan horse, I told my boss, Clayton Swisher, in a phone call that evening. I want to create a grassroots pro-gun organisation in Australia with the sole purpose of leading the NRA into believing they can speak openly to us. I've chosen Australia because that's the country the NRA keeps bashing for its gun control legislation. It was also a place I knew many Americans viewed with fondness. I thought that in the eyes of the gun lobby, a white guy from down under would probably be one of the least threatening visitors to the US imaginable, a perfect undercover operative. It was a hell of a plan, Peter. How did you put this into practice?
Well, fortunately, I had the backing of a network that was prepared to take a very large gamble on a very audacious idea. I don't think there's anywhere else in the world where something like this could be pulled off, as it were, or at least any other network that would be prepared to put time and money in these volumes into an idea of trying to infiltrate one of the most powerful gun lobby groups on the planet, or arguably the most powerful one.
And patience, Peter. There was an enormous patience. This was not something you did in a month or 6 months or a year. This was a long, patient, steady, painstaking operation.
It was, and there were many moving parts to it, not the least of which were human beings who were, at my behest, living double lives. So, I was very aware of the fact that I had two people working undercover, pretending to be someone they were not, and exposing themselves to potentially very, very dangerous situations. And, it was hairy at times, sometimes very, very hairy. It did require a lot of patience and, intense effort to pull it off, really.
Tell us about the key figure in this, Roger Muller. In himself, he is an absolutely fascinating and compelling character, someone who's a self-made man, a businessman who's been incredibly successful in his life, but someone who was prepared to play this role, have the performance skills to be able to deliver this, the credibility to be able to do it, and the nerve to be able to see it through. How did you find Roger? How did you know he was the right person?
Well, I'd actually been chasing down a whole lot of other leads. My boss at the time, Clayton Swisher, had asked me to focus my attention on ex-military or ex-police types, people who would probably appear to be much more authentic in the eyes of the NRA going in undercover. So I exhausted a lot of leads in that area and was actually very close to getting someone on board, a former homicide detective. But it just didn't quite come off. There were reservations on the part of my potential undercover people and a number of obstacles and complications. And I thought for a while that I wasn't going to find anyone who I could get to go in undercover. And then like a light bulb went off in my brain, and I thought of Roger Muller, an old friend who I just sort of had the swagger to do something like this. He's not a former cop or a former member of the army, but I just thought he's the kind of bloke who's got the gumption and the, the sort of the stomach for something like this, and also a sense of adventure. And so I put it to him, and bingo, he came on board.
How do you get someone? I mean, he had to upend his life. He had to devote himself to this. He had to take on another identity. He had to run the risk of being uncovered, and God knows what would happen in circumstances like this. And right down to creating his backstory, being able to wear a secret microphone, camera. I mean, there was so much involved in this. How did you prepare him for this?
Well, there was a lot to prepare him for. I mean, he had very little knowledge of guns. I think he'd fired a 22 on his, dad's property or something, as I did as a kid. But really, he didn't know much about guns, so he needed to be trained in guns. I flew him to America and put him through gun courses, NRA gun courses, where he was taught how to lock and load a gun and how to hide a gun and all of that kind of stuff. I flew him to London and schooled him in the art of using hidden cameras. We have a technician there who builds these very tiny hidden cameras for us, tiny weeny things he builds with a 3D printer. So I was with Roger in London as he was taught how to put these things on, where to hide them, how to use them, how to use them most effectively, where to sit when he's trying to record something undercover, to all the techniques involved. So there were many things that he needed to learn before we felt that he was ready to be sent in. And, after some schooling, some considerable time of schooling, I felt he was fully prepared to take the first steps. And so we rigged him up and sent him in to the NRA convention in Louisville, Kentucky in 2016.
I want to go to another part of the book that deals with the nature of an operation like this and the ethical minefield you have to walk in journalism when you consider something like this, and the use of cameras, the use of assumed identities, infiltration of organisations. And this is what you write. As I've made my way from newspapers to television in Australia and later in the United States, I've become increasingly aware that as society's view of journalism changed, the means by which we gathered stories needed to change too. In a world of ever more sophisticated corporate spin, it was clear to me that in the right circumstances and with sufficient prima facie evidence of wrongdoing, hidden cameras had their place as a tool for us in uncovering criminality and exposing corruption. They were also a means to explore the behind-the-scenes world that powerful lobby groups such as the NRA wanted to keep from public scrutiny. So take us through the ethical challenges here and arriving at that point where you say, okay, this organisation is big enough, influential enough, that it warrants this type of subterfuge.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's something we discussed at length for this assignment, and have in fact discussed at length for multiple other assignments where we've gone undercover. This isn't the first time we've done that. The investigative unit at Al Jazeera has deployed undercover people with hidden cameras into a range of situations. We sent someone undercover to expose the criminal syndicates trafficking rhino horn in Africa, for example, and sent someone else in undercover to expose the illegal sale of diplomatic passports in the Caribbean and more recently in other parts of the world. So, it's an argument or a discussion we've had many times on the ethical worthiness or the appropriateness of deploying something as hardcore as someone pretending to be someone they are not, wearing hidden cameras and recording people who are unaware of those cameras. It's a big step, but as I wrote and as you quoted, I felt, particularly with someone like the NRA and their attitude to the media, where they've been very secretive, very dismissive. The walls have come up whenever there's a massacre or a mass killing of any kind, mass shooting of any kind. The NRA is very combative and hostile towards the media. There is really no way a journalist can get into the heart and soul of that organization and find out how it really ticks, how its finances work, what goes on in meetings, how they formulate their public persona and how they mount attacks on the media and that sort of thing, and many other things I was interested in, without getting through their doors and gaining their trust. And we felt this was the only way to really do that, was to go in as someone they felt was one of them, and held their same philosophy. And you know, we whenever we mount undercover operations like this, you know, we're guided heavily by our lawyers. We had a team of lawyers around the world working on this. You know, very substantial lawyers from the US and the UK and Australia, all working to offer legal guidance in how we move forward with it. But the ethics I'm comfortable with. You know, I mean, there are many ways to pass an investigation like this, and many ethical sort of paths that could be explored. You know, deontological ethics, consequentialism, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, you know, Aristotelian ethics. There are many ways of looking, and many prisms through which the ethical considerations or worthiness of something like this can be examined. But really it boiled down to, is there something that is in the public interest? And that is an ethical consideration, in fact, contained in the MEAA Code of Ethics that Australian journalists adhere to. There's a rider at the end of the MEAA Code of Ethics that allows for the overriding of ethical constraints if the public interest, if the body of the journalistic work being considered contains sufficient public interest. And I believe it very much did in this particular investigation.
Yeah, I think you raised something really interesting there, and it's often something that maybe people outside of our industry don't necessarily appreciate when you see just the end product. The extent of discussion, conversation, and you know, that are often very robust around how we tell our stories and the ethics that are involved in that. You mentioned, you know, the whole sort of Kantian deontological idea, you know, the right comes before the consequences. The right exists even before whether that is necessarily going to be a good or a bad outcome. And that's especially pertinent today. I want to go to something else that you wrote in the book, and it goes very much to this idea about how journalism works in a world where, in a world where ethics are in flux. This is a conversation you had with one of your colleagues at Al Jazeera. I think the problem that we've got is that there's a battle for verifiable truth now, Phil Reese told Al Jazeera Balkans in 2019. It's as if there is no consensus over it. He said he thought the world of journalism had recently split into two distinctive strands. One is one that reveals things, new truths, and shines a light in the darkness. The other is the kind of news that's based on fear. It scares people. It reinforces their prejudices. And I think the politics of fear was deliberately formulated by certain vested interest groups that have now seen the fruition of it. And what you're talking about there is the politics of populism, the way the media is often co-opted to create fear and anxiety that political figures, political demagogues often exploit to gain power. So what is the role of journalism to be able to hold people to account, but also to stand the story up at a time when everyone thinks that they have their own truth or that there are alternative truths?
I mean, that is really the big question now, isn't it? I mean, as we move further into this post-truth environment that governs a very fragmented and divisive world where people exist within their own sort of journalistic echo chambers, if you like. It's a very it's a rapidly changing journalistic environment, not the environment that you and I grew up with, Stan, all those years ago when we first started working together. It's a different world that I don't think will ever return to what existed before. I think the most important thing any journalist can do now is to tell the truth and to copper bottom it, as it were, to make it absolutely incontrovertible. And that is what I sought to do with this investigation. And, you know, there have been, it's going undercover is not new, of course. You know, you'd be aware of the the work of Nellie Bly, who feigned insanity in the 1870s to gain access to a New York mental asylum, to report on the insane asylum's misdeeds. And she was filing newspaper reports from that institution for quite some time, pretending that she was mad. And, you know, hats off to her. That was an extraordinary thing to have done. But that's one of many examples that have happened over the years, where people have found that the only way they can get to the truth, the real truth, not the truth that that insane asylum was putting out, not the truth that the NRA is putting out, not the alternative truths that Kellyanne Conway talks about or Donald Trump puts out, but get to the truth, is to sometimes deploy tactics that were, you know, that are alien to the Australian sensibilities. And I'm quite comfortable with the way we move forward in that area. I'm quite comfortable with it.
But Peter, what started out as a story that was looking to probe the NRA and to get inside the organisation, to be able to reveal what it tries to keep hidden. But it ended up being a story that crossed continents. It ended up being a story that revealed other truths here and tapped into our own populist political movements who sought to build alliances with the NRA. Tell us how that happened. How did you make that connection between the NRA and One Nation, Pauline Hanson's One Nation?
Well, One Nation was perhaps the last group on my mind when we set out at the beginning of this quite extraordinary journey. I was focused entirely on the NRA, how they worked, you know, their internal structures, and I was very keen on recording secret video of internal discussions within the NRA. But as we moved forward in that investigation, I was looking to examine the ways the NRA was attempting to export its ideology to other countries. And I was aware that they had some success in this field in Brazil, where they had influenced public opinion on pending legislation that was going to outlaw or introduce some very strict gun laws. The NRA was very alarmed by this and deployed people to Brazil to reverse that legislation. They'd also been working in Canada, and I was interested to see where else they were trying to put out the message that more guns are good, that guns mean freedom, that guns are you know, a necessary part of life in order to build a truly secure environment and society. So I was sort of searching all over the world for evidence of NRA interference. I was looking in newspapers, scanning global media for some months. And I spotted in a Queensland newspaper during that search an article that seemed to indicate that the NRA may already have established contact in Australia with a political party, One Nation. The article indicated that One Nation had received political funding from an NRA affiliated group. And just to run down that lead, I told Roger Muller to meet with One Nation and basically sound them out, and just to go in there and you know, spruik his credentials as a gun nut, and see what their reaction was, to tell them that he was very connected to the NRA. And to my surprise, they leapt at the chance of Roger introducing them to the NRA. They hadn't at that point established any contact with the NRA. But when they asked Roger to set up meetings and basically to act as an interlocutor, I saw that as an opportunity for us to explore not only the way the NRA would interact with a foreign political party, but also to explore One Nation's motivations and activities in, in moving in the other direction.
Were you still knowing, you're a worldly man, Peter, you're not easily surprised, but were you in this case still astounded at what you heard on the tape when you had Roger Muller sitting down with Steve Dixon and James Ashby, and they started to get loose and they started to talk about their own aspirations and ambitions and what their political motives and ambitions were, and the extent of this collusion or attempted collusion and alliance with the NRA? Were you still surprised when you heard that on the tape?
Yeah, I was absolutely gobsmacked. I honestly had no idea anything like that would emerge. I was truly astonished. And I remember calling my boss, Phil Rees, at Al Jazeera and saying, you wouldn't believe what's going down. It became very clear quickly that this was not just an investigation into the NRA. This was also an investigation into an Australian political party who wanted to get close to the NRA and was, saying some absolutely astonishing things to my undercover people. It quickly transformed the whole tenor of the investigation, and we realised that we had something quite different on our hands and something quite extraordinary at the same time. So, Roger and Claudiana, the second undercover, I had a woman acting as Roger's assistant. They recorded a series of meetings that took place in Washington as the One Nation delegation visited the United States, and it was pretty amazing what happened.
Yeah, look, if you can start to send your questions through now, we have another 10 minutes or so that I want to talk to Pete, and then we can start to reflect some of your questions. I want to come in a minute, Pete, to what the NRA's influence tells us about America, about gun culture in America, about gun deaths in America, and about politics in America, and your observations having lived there on multiple occasions now, but in this latest stint for about a decade. There's a question that'll sort of bridge us to that. It's come in from Eleanor, and she asks if I could ask you, Peter, this sting was exposed, the truth was revealed, and yet One Nation still appears to have significant support in Australia, particularly in places like Queensland or regional Queensland, to be more specific. That really goes to something I think that connects to America as well, and that is culture. People often don't want to believe the truth. They would much rather believe what they want to believe. If something aligns with how they see the world, it's about identity, it's about patriotism, it's about culture, isn't it? Which is often more powerful than truth.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's about identity. It's about identifying with a particular group and sticking to that group come hell or high water. We see this with Donald Trump and his rusted on supporters. It no longer amazes me that Trump can do and say things that are just absolutely staggering, and his base is as solid as ever. There is some peeling away now, but there is a rock solid, rusted on base with Trump, and I dare say with One Nation, who will simply not be moved by truth, who will see that truth most likely as not being truthful at all. A conspiracy. A conspiracy. And, this is the hard nut to crack that we were talking about before. About getting to the absolute truth of something is sometimes a very difficult thing to achieve when there are people who will simply refuse to believe it because they are persuaded and convinced that the truth lies elsewhere.
And Peter, we know that the role of the Fourth Estate, the role of journalism in being able to hold people to account, and it performs an important democratic function. But I'm just wondering too, in the environment that we're in right now, in America, which in so many ways, and for good reason, has been a beacon of democracy. It's been something that's been held up as as a place that people look to for that sort of leadership and democracy. I'm just wondering how much more difficult it becomes in a very tribalized political environment for democracy to even hold.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is something that we're seeing playing out right now with Trumpism having played a very significant role, I think, in damaging democracy, and you know, with the whole democratic foundation, if you like, that underpinned the America that I think a lot of people once considered to be a beacon of, you know, freedom, although there were clearly, you know, flaws running through it, you know, very deep and clear flaws that are now emerging again, I think, and playing a very significant role in dismantling the place that was once a guiding light for a lot of people within, you know, a lot of nations on earth. But I think democracy is, you know, has taken some heavy hits, some really heavy blows, and you know, I don't know whether it can ever get back to the way it used to be, and what we're seeing playing out in the US now. And there were shadows of this, or some essences of it running through One Nation's rhetoric as they were negotiating with the NRA and others for funding. You know, there were examples of democracy fraying at the edges there. You know, I think it's, you know, we're in extraordinary times, and I think very, very worrying times.
And Peter, we know that journalism itself is often a reflection of this very tribalised times. We see the role of organisations like Fox News on the one hand, and perhaps you look at MSNBC or even CNN on the other, who are very polarised. You know which way people are leaning just by switching on the television. We live in an era of fake news. We've discussed that, social media, the ability of countries to meddle in elections. I'm just wondering here, and there's a terrific question from our dear friend, actually, Emma Alberici, who we know and admire and have worked with. And it goes to the cost of being able to be able to mount an operation like this. I mean, journalism is expensive. We know the business model is changing, that the cost structures are changing. It is much more difficult to find the resources to be able to do something like this. Was there a budget for something like this, or did this come with a blank check? And I did have a chuckle, knowing you as I do, Peter. And we can spend some money on the road. I did have a chuckle when you pulled over and took a phone call from your boss who said, "Peter, this is very, very expensive. You are spending a lot of money." So it wasn't necessarily a blank check, but gee, how much did it cost to be able to mount something like this?
Well, g'day, Emma, by the way. I'm glad you're there. It wasn't a blank check. We didn't ever think it was going to go on for 3 years. When I put this idea to my boss at the time and said, "I've got a very audacious idea, I hope you're on board with it," and then outlined what it was I wanted to do, I thought at that point we were probably going to be you know, we would have either succeeded or failed in getting into the NRA, probably within, you know, a year at the most. You know, having said that, that in itself is an extravagance for a lot of media organisations to allow a potential investigation to go on for a year without necessarily succeeding. So, you know, I feel very lucky that Al Jazeera was prepared to, you know, back me on that for that amount of time. But then went on, of course, not for 1 year, but for 3 years. The actual cost of it, I don't know. I'm afraid to tally it up. But it was obviously very expensive because I was flying Roger back and forwards. He was based in Australia, and every time there was a meeting that he or his assistant Claudiana or I had managed to tee up in Washington, I had him on a plane back to America. On the working under the subterfuge of it being a business trip to set up his dog food business. And there is some truth to that too, because he was in fact at that point building a dog food business in Australia, which is now up and running, and he's now fully involved in that. So, you know, there was a kernel of truth involved. But the fact that I was flying him back and forth so many times was in itself a vast expense that I doubt any networks in the world, with the exception of Al Jazeera, would have been prepared to bankroll.
Mm. And I have to ask you about Al Jazeera as well. Some of the criticism that you received, particularly from One Nation, was that this was interference by a foreign government, that somehow Al Jazeera was working for the Qatari government, and this was trying to influence or interfere in the democratic processes of Australia. How did you answer that criticism or that question? And is there a question of separation of church and state, or mosque and state, I might say, in a place like Qatar, when it comes to an organisation like Al Jazeera?
Well, the way I answer that is that at no point was there ever any pressure whatsoever put on me by the powers that be in Qatar. The only parameters that existed for this investigation were laid out by my bosses. My boss, when the thing began, was Clayton Swisher, an American fellow, very bright, ex-Marine as it turns out, who became a journalist and a commentator and somewhat of an expert in Middle Eastern affairs. And my now boss now, Phil Rees, a very bright Welshman, educated in Oxford. Both of them keen on the story. There was never any pressure from the government of Qatar. In fact, I find it risible that there could be a suggestion of that kind made. Yes, Al Jazeera is fully funded by the government of Qatar, by the Emir, the king. The ABC is fully funded by the government of Australia. The CBC is fully funded by the government of Canada. That doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't mean at all that anyone, any journalists working in investigative journalism for any of those organisations is secretly pushing a government agenda or attempting to function as a spy or an infiltrator. This was investigative journalism, pure and simple, with no interference whatsoever from the government.
Peter, I talk to you, and please keep your questions coming. There've been some terrific questions so far. I'd like to hear from more of you. I want to talk about your career. As I said at the outset, you know, you and I have worked together, and there's a mention in your book of one memorable evening that you and I spent at Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto after the release of Nelson Mandela, when you know, everyone looks at South Africa now and sees you know, that Mandela, and remembers the legacy of Mandela, but there was a lot of bloodshed in that period after his release up until the election. A lot of bloodshed between, you know, Zulu and Xhosa and others inside the country, as well as, of course, the white right-wing groups that you and I interviewed when we were there as well. But one night in Baragwanath Hospital that you mentioned, which was just awash with blood. There was just one body after another brought in, and they couldn't even find room to be able to perform the surgery on most of them. So I just want to reflect on your career and what drew you to journalism, the things you have seen, and what keeps the fire in the belly for you in journalism.
Well, I mean, like you, I'm a country boy from New South Wales, born in Deniliquin, in the Riverina. And I saw right from a very early age in my primary school days well, I felt a great urge to explore the world and find the truth of things. You know, I was very interested in news. I was reading news stories and monitoring news at a very early age, and saw journalism as an entree into an extraordinary world of trying to establish the truth and tell stories about what I'd seen, and those guiding sort of lights or principles still burn brightly within me, and always will. You know, I love the idea of getting into the nitty-gritty of a story and finding, you know, digging for the truth of something and finding out what's really going on. I love that, and it's something I always will love.
What makes a good journalist, and in the environment that we're in right now, will we still be able to do this sort of work, do you think? People like you and I enjoy the golden days, the best of journalism. Do you worry about the future of the organisation? So what do you look for in a good journalist, and what's the future of journalism?
Well, it's hard to tell what the future is. I think there'll always be a need for someone to be trying to get to the bottom of something and to tell the truth of it. The problem is that there are so many echo chambers out there. You know, there's so much polarization. I saw your comments after the debate between Trump and Biden, that the crazy tension and interruptions and toing and froing that had gone on was a reflection of the state of America right now, the state of American society right now. It's a torn, damaged, I think in many ways, broken place. And how journalism can function in that environment, it's very difficult to know for sure. I mean, there will always be a need for truth tellers, but where they sit and how they tell the truth is difficult to predict. I don't know what the future for journalism is. I don't know whether there'll be different platforms that emerge for relaying information en masse to people. There probably will in some form or other. But the basic essence, I think, is for journalists to try to be people who uncover and reveal truthful things. And that's the long and the short of it, I think.
And we have a question from Eleanor, and it does, I think, flow from that question about the future of journalism, and that is, what is the future of democracy? We really live at an interesting point, don't we? You know, I remember reading recently Freedom House, which is an organisation in the US that you're familiar with that measures the health of freedom and democracy in the world, now counts 13 straight years of declining democracy. That we are as a world less free today than we were last year or the year before or the year before that, and so on. We also live at a moment when we are seeing the emergence with the resurgence of China as a global power, of the emergence of a authoritarian superpower, that the most powerful economy in the world within a decade could be an authoritarian nation that rejects the sort of journalism that you and I are talking about. You can't practice that sort of journalism there. Do you have any reflections on your experiences, and you've worked in so many different parts of the world, and on what the future of our democracy looks like and whether you're hopeful for it?
Well, I'm generally a hopeful person, I think, so I do hope that things carry on in a positive way, but I'm very troubled by what I see happening in places like the United States now. I mean, even just the madness of the Electoral College is in itself, I guess, technically an undemocratic process. The will of the people, the majority of Americans did not vote for Trump in the 2016 elections. Is that democracy? Or is it, is it a distortion of democracy as seen by the founding fathers? There are many questions about what's happening around the world, how democracy is being interpreted and how it's playing out that I think point to a disintegration of the principles of democracy. But I don't know, I don't think anyone can really predict whether a decline or a fraying of it will continue or be arrested. And it's just difficult to say, but I am worried by what I'm seeing at the moment.
And to bring that back to the book, we've talked about the NRA as an organisation, and Australians are broadly familiar with it because we hear so much about it. But when you have gun violence, that is an epidemic that is just at extraordinary levels in the United States. And you have an organisation like the NRA. What is it about America that it cannot deal with this epidemic of gun violence, that gun laws, the likes of which we've seen in Australia, are beyond them? There appears to be, according to polls, a broad desire for some reform. Politicians talk a good game. But is this just the power of the NRA that they cannot get traction on it?
Well, the NRA has certainly been very influential in promulgating this myth that guns equal freedom. And there is this Second Amendment. The Second Amendment of the US Constitution gives American citizens the right to keep and bear arms. But, again, the founding fathers of America, I think, had a very different vision of keeping and bearing arms. And
it was a very different America, Peter. And of course, they were talking about for the purposes of a militia.
Exactly.
Not for people to be wandering around with automatic guns, machine guns, and mowing people down. It wasn't what they saw at all, was it?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't what they saw at all. And I'm sure they'd be absolutely aghast if they saw how things have unravelled from those original principles that they outlined in with that Second Amendment. But there is no way I can see America ever sort of recovering from this illness, which is gun violence writ large, that just goes on and on, day in and day out. I mean, there are mass shootings. The FBI defines a mass shooting as 3 or more people shot, killed, or wounded in any one incident. There are mass shootings going on every single day in America. Some of the big mass killings, the high school killings and that sort of thing, get public attention. But a lot of these mass shootings happen in the back streets of Baltimore and Chicago and Miami and Louisiana and places like that, Texas, and they just go unnoticed by the general public. It's a malaise. It's an illness. I don't think America can be cured of it, because there is going to be a refusal that I can never see being reversed. A refusal to accept anything that they see as an infringement on the rights of freedom. The NRA has been very successful in conflating freedom with gun ownership. If you own a gun, you're free. If you don't own a gun, you're vulnerable. You need to get a gun quickly in order to be free. It's an insane philosophy, but it's taken root, and I can't see it ever being broken.
It's a very profound observation, Peter, because I think we can also draw a line from that to the current situation with COVID. In the same way that carrying a gun is a show of patriotism, the mask has become a symbol of patriotism. To not wear a mask is to be free, is to believe in America. And that's where we've seen has been devastating. Just as gun violence is, we've seen over 200,000 Americans die precisely because they haven't followed the protocols.
Yeah, and that's so true. And it doesn't help having an administration who are so skeptical of science and who are so openly critical of people who wear masks and who observe social distancing and hand washing and all the things the CDC and others recommend. The fact that the Trump administration is so highly critical of this is is, as you suggest, I think an extension of this notion of freedom. We will not be told what to do. We will not be constrained. We will do whatever we want to do. It's our, it's our right to not wear a mask if we choose not to. These are the things, the arguments and rhetoric that runs through these crazy COVID times now, and America is obviously struggling very much with, I think now getting close to 215,000 deaths due to COVID, and I think it could be very successfully argued that many of those deaths would have been prevented if people had just worn masks and observed the CDC guidelines from the outset.
I want to ask you a question, Peter. I like to ask whenever I do these events, and that is the process of writing a book. I've written several myself. I'm working on two at the moment. One of them almost finished, and the process, it always feels like I'm beginning again each time. It's like a new journey. Having made the documentaries and then coming to write the book, for the people who have seen the documentaries, how does the book differ, and what was the process in writing the book compared to the process of making the film?
Well, the process of making the film was really a sort of taking the most gobsmacking moments from the secretly recorded video. And we had a huge amount of it. We had a ton of video. We recorded more than 500 hours of hidden camera footage. The 2 one-hour documentaries that went out probably would have utilized, I don't know, maybe 18 or 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes worth of undercover footage. So there was a vast amount of stuff not used. And the process of writing the book was drawing on that stuff that didn't hit the cutting room floor. It's not as if it had been rejected, but it was just, there was simply no room in the documentaries to put it. And when HarperCollins approached me out of the blue and asked if I would be interested in writing a book on the making of the documentary, I asked Al Jazeera if I could draw on those, the transcripts and the remainder of the hidden camera footage for the book. And there was a trove of material there, all kinds of interesting additional material and moments, conversations that had happened that I just thought were really interesting things to write about. And the process of writing the book, I loved writing the book. It was absolutely, from the moment I typed in the first sentence, I just thought, this is just fabulous. It's just so much fun to write.
And the great thing I think you can always tell when you pick up a good book is that, can you hear the voice of the person? And knowing you as I do, your voice is all through this. It's like you, Peter, sitting us down one night over a beer and saying, let me tell you a story. This is how we did this. And so it really reads that way. It's also beautifully structured. And I love the way that you're able to pull back and provide some commentary on what you're seeing, the role of the NRA, American politics, the state of journalism. There's so much woven through this. It's a terrific read. And I think for anyone who has seen the documentaries, the book is taking you into new territory. It's a supplement to the film, but it's much more. It draws parallels. It fills in the spaces. It gives depth. So it's a really, really important book. Peter, I just wanted to finish on a question that we have from, again, one of the people tuning in here tonight, Eleanor, who and I think this is a really interesting observation, and I'd be really fascinated by your thoughts on this. What you were seeing in the US, the power of the NRA, but what you saw with the infiltration potentially of One Nation and the attempts at signing a lot to align themselves with a group like the NRA, with the political tribalism of the US and the damage to its democracy. Are we a better society in Australia, or do you see the same cracks here? Perhaps not as wide or as deep, but are we not immune to the things that you're seeing in the US?
No, I don't think we're immune at all here in Australia. I think Australia tends by nature to follow things that happen in the United States. Australia has followed the lead of the United States in many things. And I can see already there are aspects of, I think, not the better angels, but the worse angels of the United States being replicated here in Australia. I think, you know, Australia has done a lot of things right. We obviously have a different political system. You know, we subscribe to the Westminster system. It's very different to the United States in its political interpretation. But
compulsory voting too, I think, mitigates against some of the extremism, doesn't it?
Totally. That makes a very big difference. It really does. That's a big issue in America, and you know, I can't see how that can be overcome. But no, I think we're not immune to the dangers of democracy being altered or you know being damaged. We're not immune to the sorts of problems that I think have infected America. Perhaps it won't happen in such a large and disturbing way, but I don't think being on this island in this hemisphere gives us immunity from anything like that.
Peter, it's been a real pleasure. You know, the conversation will continue amongst ourselves, and you know, I look to many more conversations over the years with you. It's been terrific having you back in Australia for just a little while, and our paths will cross, no doubt, in the future as well. Thanks for this conversation. It's been really fantastic. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in tonight. The book is a really important book. I think you'll get a lot out of it, even if you have seen the documentary. There is so much more here, I think, that adds context and perspective and real insight into what we're seeing in the US, in our political system and our media. Peter, thank you. We'll pass back to Emma Kate to draw the evening to a close. Thanks again, Pete.
Thanks a lot, mate. Great to see you.
Thanks so much, Stan, and thank you, Peter. This has been a fantastic discussion. We've had great engagement. We are so pleased to have hosted this event tonight, and we hope that you have all enjoyed it, your attendees tonight. I've posted the link to purchase your copy of How to Sell a Massacre in the chat box. Do grab it via that link, and thank you again for joining us tonight. I'll take everybody off mute now so that they can join me in thanking Stan and Peter. So you should all be off mute, though some people's settings are different. Lovely. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
right.
everyone.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.